Yowza! Get into it! Get into it! Yes! We're back! Ah, I have to lift my tongue down so I'm not blocking the sound as I sing. Yes, shout out to my friends of Frozen, because it is frozen out here, okay? It is cold. Some schools have had either a 2-hour delay or have simply canceled because it was negative 15 degrees this morning. So, unfortunately, there were some kids who were standing outside waiting for the bus, not knowing that school had been canceled, which I think is deplorable at best. No child should have to succumb to such frigid conditions. And I do tend to talk about my childhood and how, growing up in Cleveland, I still went to school in a foot of snow. Like, that was an actual thing. There we go. My apologies. I'm cleaning my glasses and had a bit of a smudge. Oh, it's a scratch. Oh, goodness. How did I do that? Okay, so, I have another pair, but I really like these tortoise shell, which I'm overdue to get new glasses. But you didn't come to hear a story, came to hear some magic and wonder. As I always say, you don't have to watch these videos when they go live. You're more than welcome to watch them in your downtime, nap time, max and relaxing, chillaxing time, in between time, mean time, scheme time, study time, break time, CP time. Anytime that you want to hear a highly animated voice bring you wonderful stories of magic, fantasy, science fiction, adventure, and many, many more in between. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 12. It took Barney a long time to make his way down the hill past the house. There had been no sign of Great Uncle Mary on the headland. On the road, knots of wandering people were scattered maddeningly there we go, about in his path, and 3 times he had to stand aside as a car came grinding up the steep, narrow slope. Barney dodged impatiently to and fro, in and out, with Rufus at his heels. Halfway down the hill, he heard music from the other side of the harbor, and through the heads he caught sight of the dancing procession moving forward along the quay. Slipping his fingers inside Rufus's collar, he sidestepped through the thickening crowd and down the hill as fast as he could, darting through every visible gap like a shrimp in a pool. When he reached the corner of the harbor, the procession was upon him, and he could see nothing at all but an impenetrable wall of legs and backs. He wriggled through behind them, the din of the music thumping in his ears, until he was out of the crowd at last on the quay. With a sigh of relief, he let go of Rufus's collar and ran with him towards the deserted quarter where he had arranged to meet Simon and Jane. There was nobody there. Barney looked around wildly. He could see nothing to give him the slightest hint of where the others had gone. Reasoning with himself, he decided they must have caught sight of Mrs. Polk. She had been very keen on the idea of the carnival and the dancing. She must be in the procession, and it had been Simon and Jane's job to go and find her, as it had been to his to go and scout on the headland. They must have gone chasing her, knowing that he would guess where they had gone. Satisfied, Barney went off to find the carnival. He followed the last of the crowd still drifting up the road. Even down into the sheltered harbor, the wind was blowing in from the sea, but now and again it dropped for a moment, and Barney heard a tantalizing snatch of music come wafting over the roofs from somewhere in the village. Pum, pum, de pum, pum, pum. All around him, people were wandering aimlessly about, idly talking. Where have they gone? We can meet them at the ground. But they danced through the streets for ages yet. Oh, come on. Disregarding them, Barney set off down a little side turning. With Rufus still lopping patiently at his heels, he wandered from one winding lane into another, down narrow passages where the slat roofs almost touched overhead, past neat front doors with their brass knockers gleaming golden in the sun, through cobbled alleyways where front doors opened not onto a pavement but straight onto the street. For a small place through Essex seemed to be an extraordinary endless maze of winding little roads. Straining his ears all the time, Barney followed the sound of the music through the maze. He made one of 2 false turns, losing the sound. Then gradually the band grew louder, and with it he began to hear the voices and the rasping shuffle of feet. He snapped his fingers to Rufus and broke into a trot, swinging from one quiet, deserted little alley into the next, and then suddenly the noise burst out on him like a storm, and he was out of the muffling narrow street and among the crowds, out in the sunshine, filling a broad road where the procession jogged and danced by. "Come on, my white-headed boy," someone called to him, and the people nearby turned and laughed. Barney could not see Simon and Jane amongst the dancers, and there seemed little chance of being able to get to them even if he did. He gazed fascinated around him in the bobbing giant heads, the bodies beneath them fantastic and gay in doublets and red, yellow, blue hose. Everywhere he saw costume figures, a man dancing stiff as a tree, a solid flapping mass of green leaves, pirates, sailors, a hussar in bright red with a tall cap, slave girls, jesters, a man in long blue silk gown made up as a pantomime dame, a girl all in black twirling sinuous as a cat with a cat's bewhiskered head, little boys in green as Robin Hood, little girls with long fair hair as Alice, highwaymen, Morrismen, flower sellers, gnomes. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. The dancers whirled in and out of the crowd on the edge of the street where he stood, and then suddenly, before Barney knew what was happening, they were dancing round him. He felt someone catch at his hand, and he was drawn out into the center of the dancing crowd, among the ribbons and feathers and bright bobbing heads, so that his feet fell into step with the rest. Breathless, grinning, he glanced up. The black-gloved hand holding one of his own belonged to the figure of the cat, twirling in the skin-close black tights with the long black tail swinging out behind, and whiskers bristling long and straight from the head mask fitting over the cheeks. He saw the eyes glint through the slits and the teeth flash. For a moment among the dancing figures all around, he saw close to him one in a great feathered red Indian headdress with a face startlingly like Mrs. Polk. But as he opened his mouth to call, the black cat seized both his hands and wheeled him around and around in a dizzy spiral through the ranks of the crowd. People glanced down at him and smiled as he passed, and Barney, giddy with the music and the speed of the twisting black limbs of the cat before his eyes, flung himself round, laughing where it swung him, until he came with a sudden halt against the long white robes of a figure dressed as an Arab Sikh, moving with the rest so that the robes were swung wide and billowing by the breeze. Glancing up through a world swaying with his own giddiness, Barney had come time only of glimpse of a slim figure in a dark-skinned, lean face, before the cat swung him by the hands straight into the outswung, muffling folds of the man's white robes. The robe twisted around him as he staggered, still laughing in the sudden gloom, and then so quickly that he had no time even to feel alarmed. The man's arm came round him like an iron band and lifted him from the ground, and the other hand muffled his mouth in the folds of the cloth, and Barney felt himself being carried away. First of all, kids, if any time you have a stranger trying to take you somewhere or claiming that they talk to your parents or your guardian or whatever the case, run. Run and find an adult you feel like will care and trust, or find a police officer or somebody you think who will listen, or your teacher if you're near school, or an administrator if you're near school, or a security guard if you're near school, and tell them. There are people who kidnap children and are evil and hateful creatures, and the best thing you can do is see something, say something. Before he could struggle, he was swung in a scuffling moment through the roaring music of the crowd, pushing ineffectually against the man's chest. He felt him run a few steps and heard the noise of the voices of the band slowly grow fainter. He kicked out blindly and felt his toes hit the man's shins, but he was only wearing sandals that could not do great harm. The man gave a muffled curse but did not pause, jolted him along for a few more steps until Barney felt himself swung higher into the air and dropped onto a padded seat that protested with the noise of springs. The robe fell loose from his mouth. He yelled and went on yelling until a hand came back and pressed hard against his face. A girl's voice said urgently, "Quickly, get him away!" A voice came almost as light as a girl's, but masculine, said curtly, "Get in, you'll have to drive." Barney suddenly lay quite still, all his senses alerted. There was nothing familiar about the second voice. He felt a coldness at the back of his neck, then the pressure of the hand over his mouth relaxed a little through the cotton folds, and the voice said softly, close to his ear, "Don't make a noise, Barnabas. Don't move, and nobody will be hurt." And suddenly Barney knew that the black-masked figure of the cat in the dark matted Sikh robes, he felt the seat shudder slightly as the noise of a powerful car's engine coughed, and then rose in a throbbing yowl. And then the note deepened, and he felt a lurch and knew that he was being driven away. Rufus jumped nervously back for the shuffling, dancing feet that had enclosed Barney in the crowd. Tentatively, he put his nose forward to follow, once, twice, but always a heel came up in the way with an accidental kick, and he had to dodge away. From a safer distance, he barked loudly, but the sound was lost at once in the booming music and the clamor of the crowd. Alarmed by the shattering noise and bluster, suddenly filling his small world, he put his ears back flat against the side of his head. His tail was down between his legs, and he showed the whites of his eyes. He retreated farther from the noise, waiting hopefully on the corner of the street for Barney to reappear. But there was no sign of him. Rufus moved uneasily. Then as the band drew directly opposite, blowing and banging only a few yards away, rocking every corner with a rise and fall of music that, to a dog's ears, was a menacing, roaring noise, Rufus could suddenly stand it no longer. He gave up all hope of Barney, and turning his back on the clamor of the carnival, he padded away from down the alley, with the tip of his tail sweeping the ground and his nose lowered, sniffling his way home. Simon and Jane rejoined one another at the corner of the harbor, quiet again now in the sunny afternoon. Well, I've been back to where we said. He isn't there.
I had a good look at the house. He hasn't been there either.
Do you think he could have gone off after Mrs. Polk?
I keep telling you, he couldn't have been Mrs. Polk you saw.
I don't see why not. If only you hadn't stopped me, I could have grabbed her.
How can we meet Barney here if you...
Simon began.
Oh, all right, but we haven't met him.
Well, then, he can't have come down from the headland yet. Jane's expression changed.
Oh, dear. Perhaps he's gotten into trouble up there.
No, don't worry about when we don't need to. More likely he's found a great Uncle Mary after all, and they're both up there still.
Well, come on then, let's go and look.
The car swayed and growled as if it were alive. Barney lay wrapped up like a parcel in the robe which Mr. Withers had slipped from his own shoulders as he dropped him in the car. He decided that it must be a sheet. The smell of it under his nose was like clean laundry on the beds at home. But he wasn't at home. He muttered peevishly under his breath and kicked at the side of the car. Now, said Mr. Withers. He took hold of Barney's legs and swung him none too gently round into a sitting position, at the same time pulling the sheet clear of his face. I think perhaps we might let you emerge now, Barnabas. Barney blinked, dazzled by the sudden sunlight. Before he could open his eyes properly to look at the road, the car swung squealing through a gap in the high wall and slowed down, its wheels crunching on the gravel along a tree-lined drive. Nearly there, Mr. Withers said placidly. Barney twisted his head to glare up at him. He could barely recognize Mr. Withers' face through the dark brown stain that turned him into an Arab, the eyes and teeth glinting unnaturally white, and behind the makeup the man seemed withdrawn and pleased with himself, almost arrogant.
Where are we? Where are you taking me?
Don't you know? Ah, no. The dark head nodded wisely. Of course you would not. Well, you will know soon, Barnabas. What do you want? Barney demanded. Want? Nothing, my dear boy. We're just taking you for a little ride to meet a friend of ours. I think you'll get very well together. Barney saw through the trees that they were coming to a house. He looked down at the sheets still twined round him and wriggled to move his arms free. Mr. Withers turned quickly. Take this stupid thing off of me. I feel silly. Just a little joke of ours, Mr. Withers said. Where's your sense of humor, Barnabas? I thought you were enjoying yourself. He leaned over again, pulling the sheet free as the car drew up outside the peeling front door of a big, deserted-looking house. You'll have to hop out if you can. I can't loosen it properly in here. He spoke casually, easily, with no trace of menace in his voice, and as Barney glanced up at him suspiciously, the white teeth shone briefly again in a smile. The girl slipped out of the driving seat and moved like a snake in her black tights and came around to open the door at Barney's side. She helped him out and spun him round to pull the sheet away. Barney staggered, his arms and legs so stiff with cramp that he could hardly move. Polly Withers laughed. Her head was still a fantastic sight in the close-fitting black cat's mask covering all over her face but the eyes and mouth.
I'm sorry, Barney, she said companionably. We overdo it a bit, didn't we? You danced jolly well, I thought. I was almost sorry to stop. Still, never mind. Now we'll go and have some tea if it isn't too early for you.
I haven't had any lunch, Barney said irrelevantly, suddenly remembering.
Well, in that case, we must certainly get you something to eat. Good gracious, no lunch, and if it's all our fault, I expect. Norman, ring the bell. We must feed the poor boy.
Mr. Withers, making a concerned clicking noise with his tongue, crossed from the car and pressed the bell next to the big door. He was all in white still, but his shirt sleeves of white flannels without his Arab robe. His bare arms were stained the same dark brown as his face. Barney followed him slowly, with the girl's hand resting lightly on his shoulder, was puzzled by their friendliness. He began to wonder whether he had been seeing everything in the wrong light. Perhaps this was, after all, only a joke, part of the fun of the carnival day. Perhaps the Witherses were perfectly ordinary people after all. They had never actually done anything to prove beyond doubt that they were the enemy. Perhaps he and Simon and Jane had got all things wrong. Then he heard footsteps echoing faintly within the house, clumping gradually nearer, and the door was opened. At first he did not recognize the figure in tight black jeans and a green shirt. Then he saw that it was the boy, Bill Hoover, who had chased Simon for the map. And in a moment he remembered the scene on Kamar Head that day, and the greed on Miss Withers's face when she had looked at the map, and he knew that they had not been wrong after all. Bill's face lit up out of his downturned sullenness as he saw Barney, and he grinned across at Miss Withers. "You gotten thin?" he said. Mr. Withers cut in quickly, stepping forward and almost pushing the boy out of the way. "Hello, Bill," he said smoothly. "We brought a young friend of ours on a visit. I don't think anyone will mind. We could all do with something to eat. Run and see if you can manage to rustle anything up, will you?" "Mind?" the boy said. "I should say not." He looked at Barney again with the same eager, unpleasant grin, then turned and disappeared down the long corridor, calling something into an open doorway as he passed. "Come along in, Barney," the girl said. She propelled him gently through the door and shut it behind her. Barney looked around him in the long, empty passage at the marks of damp on the fading wallpaper, and he felt very small and lonely. He heard a deep voice call from somewhere inside the house.
"Withers? Is that you?"
Mr. Withers, who had been standing surveying Barney with a slight smile, jumped and put his hand half-consciously up to his collar. "Come," he said curtly. He took Barney by the hand and led him down the corridor, their footsteps echoing on the uncarpeted wooden floor to the doorway of a room at the far end. It was a big room, dark after the blazing sunlight outside. Long windows stretched from floor to ceiling in one wall, with long shabby velvet curtains half pulled across, and the light that shafted in between them fell on a big square desk in the center of the room, its top littered with papers and books. The room seemed empty. Then Barney jumped as he saw a tall man move in the shadow beyond the sunlight.
"Ah," said the deep voice. "I see you've brought the youngest of them, the white-haired child. I am most interested to make his acquaintance. How do you do, Barnabas?"
He held out his hand and Barney, bemused, took it. The voice was not pleasant. The voice was not unpleasant and rather kind. "How do you do?" he said faintly. He looked up at the tall man, but in the half-light he had only a vague impression of a deep-shadowed eyes under dark, heavy brows and a clean-shaven face. The smooth edge of a silk jacket brushed his hand.
"I was about to have a cool drink, Barnabas," the man said courteously, as if he were talking to someone older than himself. "Will you join me?"
He waved his hand towards the shadows, and Barney saw the glint of silver and a white cloth on the low table beside the desk. "The boy has had nothing to eat, sir," Miss Withers said behind Barney in a peculiarly hushed, reverent voice. "We thought perhaps Bill could fetch something." Her voice died away. The man looked at her and grunted.
Very well, very well. Polly, for goodness sake, go and change into some normal clothes. You look ridiculous. The necessity for fancy dress is over. You are not at the carnival now."
He spoke sharply, and Barney was astonished at the meekness with which Miss Withers answered him. "Yes, sir, of course." She slipped away into the passage, sleek and inhuman in the black cat skin.
"Come in, my boy, and sit down."
He spoke softly again, and Barney came slowly forward into the room and sat down in an armchair. It creaked with the crackling rustle of wickerwork, and he suddenly felt for an instant that he had been in the room before. He glanced around, and his eyes, growing accustomed to the dim light at the dark walls and the shelves of books rising to the ceiling, there was something, but he could not place it. Perhaps it was just the room reminded him a little of the gray house. As if he read his thoughts, the man answered,
I hear you are on holiday in the gray house above the harbor.
Barney said, surprised at his own daring. It must be a very interesting house. That seems to be the only thing anyone ever says to us. The man leant forward, resting his hand on the edge of the desk.
Oh?
The deep voice rose a little with eagerness.
Who else has asked you about it?
Oh, no one important, Barney said hastily. After all, it's a nice house. Do you live here, Mr.
My name is Hastings,
the big man said, and at the sound of the name, Barney again felt the flicker of familiarity, vanishing as soon as it came.
Yes, I do. This is my house. Do you like it, Barnabas?
It's rather like the Grey House, as a matter of fact, Barney said. The man turned back towards him.
Indeed. Now what makes you say that?
Well, Barney began, but when the door opened again and Bill came in carrying an enormous tray with a big jug of milk and some bottles of lager, glasses, and a plate piled with sandwiches, he crossed the room to where the tall man stood and put the tray down on the desk, nervously, just within reach as if he were frightened to come too near. Miss Withers said for something to eat, sir, he said gruffly, already backing towards the door. The man waved him away without speaking. The sight of the sandwiches made Barney realize how long it was since breakfast, and he felt more cheerful, and he sat back in the creaking chair and glanced around him. It could have been worse, he thought. The mysterious Mr. Hastings seemed to mean him no harm, and he was beginning to enjoy the sight of all their enemies cringing in terror before someone else. He took a sandwich from the plate and held it out to him and bit into it cheerfully. The bread was soft and new with plenty of butter, and in the middle there was some delicious kind of potted meat. He began to feel better still. Mr. Withers moved silently across to the desk and poured him out a glass of milk. They began opening the bottles of lager. The big man called Hastings, sat down in the chair behind the desk and swung gently from side to side, regarding Barney thoughtfully from behind his heavy brows. He sat softly, conversationally.
Is it buried under the Grey House, Barnabas, or one of the standing stones?
Halfway through a gulp of milk, Barney suddenly choked. He groped for the desk and put his glass down with a bang and leaned forward, coughing and spluttering. Mr. Withers, soft-footed, crossed to pat him on the back.
Dear me, Barnabas, he murmured, has something gone down the wrong way?
Barney, his mind working furiously, went on coughing for rather longer than he intended to. When he looked up, he took refuge instinctively in innocence. I'm sorry, I caught my breath, he said. Did you say something?
I think... you heard perfectly well what I said,
Mr. Hastings said, and stood up again, towering very tall over Barney in the low chair, and walked over to the window with a glass of lager in his hand. The light fell off his face for the first time, and watching, Barney felt a slight chill of uneasiness at the flat, permanent scowl of the brows and the grim lines running down the mouth. It was a strong, faraway face, something like his great-uncle's, but with a frightening coldness behind it that was not like Great-Uncle Mary's. Barney found himself wishing very much that there was somebody to tell Great-Uncle Mary where he had gone. Mr. Hastings held up his glass to the window. The sunlight shone through it clear and golden.
An ordinary glass of beer,
he said abstractedly,
until you hold it against the light. And then it becomes quite transparent. You can see right through it.
He swung around on Barney so that he was silhouetted dark and menacing against the window. As transparent as every single thing that you children have been doing these past days. Do you think we have not seen through it all? Do you think we have not been watching? I don't know what you mean, Barney said.
You may be a stupid little boy, Mr. Hastings said, but not, I think, as stupid as all that. Come along. We know that you found a map, and that with the help of your esteemed great-uncle, Professor Lion,
his mouth twisted on the words as if he were tasting something unpleasant.
Mr. Professor Lion.
You've been attempting to trace the place to which it leads. We know that you have come very near the end of that track.
And since, my dear Barnabas, we cannot afford to risk your reaching the end of it, we have decided at last to draw in the net and put a stop to your little quest. This and that is what you are doing here.
Barney shivered at the menace in the cold, deep voice. His mouth felt very dry. He reached forward and picked up the glass of milk again and took a long drink. "I'm sorry," he said, blinking wide-eyed at Mr. Hastings over the rim of the glass and licking a mustache of milk away from his upper lip. "I don't know what you mean. Could I have another sandwich, please?" Behind him, he heard Mr. Withers' sharp, shocked intake of breath, and for a second a very small voice deep inside his brain crowed with triumph, but he watched the tall figure by the window apprehensively. It seemed to grow for a moment and loom still more menacingly over him. And then he moved abruptly back into the dim shadow of the rest of the room.
"Give him another sandwich," Mr. Hastings said, "and then you can go, Withers. You know what you have to do. We haven't much time. Come back when I ring."
Mr. Withers, his dark-stained face scarcely visible in the room, pushed the plate of sandwiches across to Barney's elbow. He said, obsequiously, there we go, "Yes, sir." And ducking his head in a bow, he went out of the room. Barney took another sandwich, feeling fatistically that whatever was likely to happen, he might as well eat. "Why do they all call you sir?" he said curiously. The tall man came and sat down at the desk again, playing with a pencil between his fingers.
"Who is there that you would call sir?"
"Well, nobody really, only the masters at school."
"Perhaps I am one of those masters,"
Mr. Hastings said. "But they aren't at school."
"I think you would not really understand, Barnabas. In fact, there are a great many things that you do not understand. I wonder what stories that great uncle of yours has put into your head. Has he told you that we are bad and wicked, no doubt, and that he is a good man?"
Barney blinked at him and took another bite of his sandwich. Mr. Hastings smiled grimly.
"Ah, but of course you do not know what I am talking about. You haven't the slightest idea."
The heavy irony in the deep voice made Barney wrinkle his nose.
"Well, let us forget that just for a moment and just pretend that you do know what I mean. You've been led to believe I think that my friends and I are everything that is evil, that we want to follow up the clues in the map because we can do bad things with what we find. You have nothing to go on but your great uncle's word and perhaps one or two strange things that Polly or Norman Withers may seem to have done."
The voice dropped until it was silky and very gentle.
"But just think of it, Barnabas, of the strange things your great uncle does. Coming out of nowhere and vanishing again. He has vanished again today. Ah, yes. Has he not? Well, not of course. You can't answer me because we're only pretending that you know what I'm talking about. But this is not the first time he has unexpectedly disappeared, I think. And it will not be the last."
He stared at Barney, dark eyes penetrating and level from beneath the overhanging brow. Barney ate his sandwich a little more slowly, unable to take his own gaze away. Oh, goodness. Sorry about that.
As for our being evil, well now, Barnabas, do I strike you as a bad man? Have I done you any harm? There you sit, eating and drinking quite happily, certainly not looking alarmed. Are you frightened of me?
"You had me kidnapped," Barney said flatly.
"Oh, come now, that was just a little joke of Polly's. I wanted to talk to you, that's all."
Mr. Hastings sat back in his chair and spread his arms wide with the tip of his fingers just touching the edge of the desk.
"Now look, my boy, I will make a bargain with you. I will tell you what is actually behind everything that has been going on these last days, and you will stop playing this game of not having seen the map."
He did not wait for Barney to say anything.
"We are indeed hunting the same thing that your great uncle is hunting, my friends and I. But whatever story is spun about us is, quite frankly, a lot of moonshine. Your great uncle is a scholar, and an outstanding one. Nobody would dispute that, and I probably know it better than you. The trouble is that he himself knows it and thinks about it much too much."
"What do you mean?" said Barney indignantly.
When a man is famous for being a very great scholar, he wants very much to go on being famous. You found this old manuscript, you and your brother and sister, and when you told your great uncle about it, he realized, as you did not, how important it was. When he saw it, he was even more certain. Now I, Barnabas, am the curator. That means the director of one of the most important museums in the world. I have been hunting the manuscript that you found, and especially what it leads to, for a very long time. They are both very important to the people who study such things, and could make a lot of difference to the total of knowledge there is in the world. And your great uncle knew that I was hunting them. But when you found the manuscript, he saw that he had a chance of achieving the quest himself. The more he knew about this, the more attractive an idea it seemed. He has always been famous as a man who knows a great deal about the part of history these things are connected with. If he were to find them, he would know more than anyone else in the world. People would say, what an amazing man Professor Lion is, to know so much. There is no one like him anywhere.
To know how much? Barty said.
You would not understand the details,
Mr. Hastings said shortly. Then his voice dropped again to that same deep, persuasive note.
Don't you see, Barnabas? Your uncle is concerned only with his own fame. Do you think for one moment that when you have entered the hunt, any of the credit will go to you children? It will all go to him. Whereas I, and my museum, and the people I employ, believe that all knowledge should be shared, and that no one man has the right to it alone. And if you were to help us, we would take care that you had whatever credit was due to you. The whole world should know what you had done.
In spite of himself, Barty had forgotten his sandwich and milk. He sat listening, troubled, trying to understand the truth for himself. Yes, Great Uncle Mary was strange, often not like other men, but all the same. He said, slow and perplexed, Well, I don't know. All this just doesn't sound like Great Uncle Mary. Surely he couldn't do anything like that.
But I assure you,
Mr. Hastings jumped to his feet and began walking to and fro between the desk and the door. He seemed unable to keep still any longer.
many people who knows well, often most excellent people, can prove capable of the most curious acts. I do believe and realize that you may be surprised and shocked, but this is the truth, Barnabas, and it is very much more simple than you have been led to believe.
Barty said, So we ought to give the map to you and let you find the... Just in time, he caught back the word Grail. Through the whole conversation, there had been no mention of what the map led to. Perhaps they knew less than they said they did. Perhaps that was one of the things they wanted to trap him into telling them. Mr. Hastings paused for a second.
Yes,
he said. Well, and let you find whatever it is it leads to. Barney picked up the glass of milk again and drank reflectively, because then you would put whatever it is in your museum, and everybody will be able to know about it. Mr. Hastings nodded gravely.
There you have it, Barnabas. All knowledge is sacred, but it should not be secret. I think you understand. There is something you should do, that we should do, in the name of scholarship.
Barney looked down into his milk, swishing it gently around the glass. But isn't that what Great Uncle Mary's doing?
No, no!
Mr. Hastings swung impatiently on his heel, striding impatient and very tall up and down the room.
Whatever he does, he is doing it in the name of Professor Lion, and that is all. What else would he do anything for?
Barney never knew afterwards who put the words into his head. He spoke before he thought, and almost as if someone else were speaking through him, he heard him say clearly, In the name of King Arthur, and of the old world before the dark came. The tall, dark figure stopped abruptly, completely still, with its back still turned. For a moment there was an absolute silence in the room. It was as if Barney had pressed a switch that would at any moment bring an avalanche thundering down. He sat motionless and almost breathless in his chair. Then very slowly the figure turned. Barney gulped and felt a prickling at the roots of his hair. Mr. Hastings was at the darker end of the room, near the door, and his face was hidden in shadow, but he seemed to loom taller and more threatening than he had ever done before, and when he spoke there was a different throb in the deep voice that paralyzed Barney with fear.
You will find Barnabas Drew,
he said softly.
that the dark will always come and always win.
Barney said nothing. He felt as if he had forgotten how to speak, and his voice had died forever with his last words. Mr. Hastings did not take his eyes off him. He reached out beside him and tugged twice at a cord hanging down from the ceiling beside the door. Within seconds, the door swung open and Mr. Withers slipped noiselessly inside. He had washed the dark brown stain from his arms and face.
Is everything ready?
Said the deep voice. Yes, sir. Mr. Withers hissed absequously. I'm having trouble with that word. I'm so sorry. The car is at the side of the door. The girl has changed. She will drive again.
You will drive with her. I shall follow in the closed car with the boy. Bill has it ready.
The engine is running already. Where are you taking me? Barney's voice rose shrill in fright, and he jumped down from his chair, but he could not run out of the room past the tall figure that still held his gaze.
You are coming with us to the sea,
said the voice beyond the dark, intent eyes.
You will cause no trouble, and you will do whatever I say. And when we are on the sea, Barnabas, you are going to tell us about your map and show us where it leads.
And that is where we will end for today. As always, I thank you all for watching. This story gets very dark, hence the title, The Dark is Rising sequence. Ooh, I got goosebumps doing that. I always love playing villains whenever I do my narrations, because I can always give them a certain color, a certain twang, a certain darkness to my voice when I bring them to life. So that was a lot of fun for me. But without further ado, I'll see you all next time. Bye, lovelies. Have a great day.